Welcome back to your daily archive. Today, we unearth a file stained with the dust of a forgotten tragedy. The year was 1943. Calcutta was the jewel of the British Empire, a bustling hub for the Allied war effort. But while the world looked at the battlefields of Europe, a silent, invisible monster was being fed in the east. It didn't start with a storm. It started with the stroke of a fountain pen in a distant cold office. Fearing a Japanese invasion, the British authorities enacted a ruthless, scorched earth policy. They didn't just burn documents. They destroyed over 40,000 local wooden boats, the very lifeblood of the Bengali people. In one afternoon, the fishermen lost their nets and their only way to feed their families. The supply chain of an entire province was severed, not by the enemy, but by their own masters. The rice markets grew quiet as the grain stores vanished into heavily guarded military warehouses, and then the shuffling began. Thousands of figures, reduced to walking shadows, dragging themselves toward the city of Calcutta. They hoped for a scrap of bread, for a single grain of rice that would never come. They were unaware that behind the closed doors of the city's elite clubs, British officers were still being served 5-course meals as if the world outside didn't exist. Their hunger was not a tragedy of nature, it was a calculated, strategic necessity of the war effort. By the time they reached the city gates, many were too weak to even ask for help. The sidewalks of Calcutta became a gallery of the forgotten. The shadow had fallen over the heart of Bengal, and it was only getting darker. If you want to see the documents they tried to burn and uncover the truth, stay with us as we dive deeper into this nightmare. While the people of Bengal faded into the dust, the true architects of their suffering were thousands of miles away. In the grand, heavily guarded rooms of the War Cabinet in London, there was no famine. There were only numbers, ledgers, and cold, calculated equations. The horrifying irony of the year 1943 was not a lack of food. India produced enough grain to feed its entire population, but that harvest was never meant for them. Under direct orders from London, massive cargo ships, loaded with Indian wheat and rice, sailed away from the starving province. They were heading to Europe to build a reserve buffer for British soldiers who were already fully rationed. The colonial government in India realized the impending catastrophe. They sent desperate telegrams begging for the exports to stop. Those telegrams eventually reached the desk of the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, a man hailed as a hero in the West but viewed as a ruthless tyrant in the East. His response to the pleas for help was not compassion. Instead, he famously noted that the crisis was their own fault for breeding like rabbits. He ordered that the relief ships currently in the Indian Ocean should bypass India entirely. Bureaucracy became a weapon more efficient than any bomb. Even when America and Canada offered to send wheat to Bengal, London refused the shipments. They claimed it would tie up valuable shipping lanes needed for the war. The famine was not a mistake. It was a mathematical decision. A decision signed in ink that sealed the fate of millions. While London protected its reserves, an invisible wall was drawn around Bengal, trapping its people in a city that was slowly turning into a massive open-air tomb. The ledger was closed in London, but the nightmare was just unfolding in the streets of Calcutta. The walking shadows, the millions displaced from the countryside, finally reached the city gates, hoping for salvation. But what they found was a metropolis completely indifferent to their suffering. Fathers who had proudly farmed the land now held out empty tin cups with trembling hands, but their weak cries for help were drowned out by the sounds of high society. In the heart of the city, famous restaurants and elite clubs remained brightly lit, fully stocked with imported luxuries. While just inches away, separated only by a thin pane of glass, the starving pressed their hollow faces against the windows. They watched plates of roasted meat and untouched bread being casually cleared away by waiters. Even the discarded scraps from the tables were denied to them, locked away in bins to prevent riots. Exhausted, with absolutely nothing left to give, families began to collapse right on the grand pavements. The pristine sidewalks of Chowringhi Avenue slowly transformed into open-air waiting rooms for the inevitable. Hospitals locked their gates, completely overrun, turning away thousands into the unforgiving heat. Mothers sat in the thick dust, holding fragile children who had simply stopped crying. They had no tears left, no energy to beg. There was only a quiet, terrifying stillness. Every morning, before the elite awoke, the municipal trucks would roll slowly through the mist. Their grim task was to clear the motionless figures that littered the streets like fallen autumn leaves. The sheer volume of the fallen overwhelmed the city's ability to even keep a record. Calcutta had become a theater of the macabre, a city where the living simply stepped over the fallen without a second glance. The British Empire had turned its brightest jewel into a landscape of utter unimaginable despair. And the world knew absolutely nothing about it because the censors were watching everything. While Bengal was consumed by a man-made silence, the world remained blindfolded behind a wall of strict military censorship. In the high-ceilinged rooms of the War Press Censor's office in Calcutta, not a single telegram crossed the border. Every sentence, every photograph had to be approved, and inconvenient visuals simply vanished. Local Indian photographers who attempted to capture the tragedy had their cameras seized and their film destroyed. But from within the silence, an unexpected act of defiance emerged. The editor of Calcutta's leading British-owned newspaper had seen enough. He realized that documenting the tragedy was the only way to break the blockade, and he decided to publish everything. By dawn, the forbidden images finally hit the streets of Calcutta, exposing the horrifying reality. The elite awoke to visuals they could no longer ignore, and the official narrative began to unravel. Copies of the photographs were quickly smuggled out of India to international media, bypassing the imperial censors completely. The shocking evidence reached Washington, D.C., sparking private concern and formal inquiries about the stability of the Allied supply base. United States officials quietly questioned London's resource management, suggesting that intervention was in the strategic interest of the war. Winston Churchill's war cabinet was furious at the breach, demanding strict control over all visual documentation immediately. London deflected the inquiries, claiming that American involvement would interfere with sovereign British administration. Offers of immediate grain aid from America and Canada were subtly delayed and deliberately rerouted. Bureaucratic red tape became the empire's last defense against the inconvenient visual truth. The censors increased their efforts, raiding printing presses and destroying more photographic equipment. The defiant voices in Calcutta were eventually silenced, but the file on Bengal was already torn wide open. The knowledge of what was truly happening could no longer be erased. It could only be buried in deeper, darker archives. The information was trapped, but the ghosts of the millions who fell were not as easy to suppress. The streets were eventually cleared, but the darkest chapter of this tragedy was what the empire did after the war was won. In 1945, the world celebrated the fall of tyranny and the grand triumph of the Allied forces. But amidst the cheering crowds and falling confetti, the immense shadow over Bengal was quietly swept under the rug. Over 3 million souls had vanished into the dust, a staggering, unimaginable loss. Yet this monumental catastrophe was treated as a mere footnote, an inconvenient detail of the war. Official inquiries were eventually launched, but their conclusions were written by the very men who orchestrated the crisis. The final reports blamed a cyclone, a poor harvest, and the local population itself. The deliberate export of grain, the destroyed boats, the denied aid were deliberately omitted from the official narrative. Those responsible for the administrative blockade did not face tribunals. Instead, they received medals of honor. Winston Churchill was cemented in history as the undisputed savior of the free world, while the millions who fell under his policies were entirely erased from Western textbooks. The survivors in Bengal were left to carry a psychological trauma that would span generations. Their society was permanently fractured, and their trust in the empire was shattered forever. It remains one of the greatest hypocrisies of the 20th century. A global war fought in the name of freedom, built upon the silent, suffocating sacrifice of a captive nation. For decades, the true scale of the Bengal tragedy remained locked away in classified archives, hidden from the public eye. The dust of 1943 has long settled, but the moral stain on the empire can never be washed away. It leaves us with a chilling realization. History is always written by the victors, but the absolute truth is always buried with the fallen. If you want to uncover more of the dark, erased chapters of our past, hit the subscribe button and welcome to your daily archive.